In this lesson video, we are going to discuss on how to do basic final rendering in Blender. If you want to follow along, you can use the file I provided for this lesson. Here, we have the same monkey head model from the previous lesson, and we already have the camera and the image resolution set up. Before we hit the render button, we should do a render preview first, and we can do this by using the rendered view mode. In this mode, with the camera view active, we can have a very accurate preview of how the final rendering will look like. But notice how dark the scene is. If you compare this against the look depth mode, where everything is lit properly. Well, the difference is, in the look depth mode, we get decent lighting from the environment preset that Blender provides. This makes sense because the look depth mode is designed for users to quickly preview and adjust the materials without requiring them to create any light sources in the scene. If you turn on the scene world lighting option here, now we get the real lighting condition like when we do the final rendering. Basically, in the final rendering, the environment lighting that we have in the look depth mode does not exist. And because we don't have any light sources, the scene looks very dark. I know we haven't discussed about lighting yet, so for now, we can just borrow the EXR file used in the look depth environment lighting and use that for our final rendering. So how can we do that? Well, in the final rendering, we can control the environment using the world setting here. Notice if I increase the background color value, for example, the scene becomes brighter. But it looks so dull. This is because there is nothing to reflect on the object's surfaces except this solid color. We can use the EXR file to override this color value. To do that, we can click on this small circle here and then choose Environment Texture. Now, suddenly, the scene looks pink or bright purple. Don't worry, this is just a way for Blender to warn us that we just used an environment texture, but we haven't assigned any image for it. To select the image, we can click on this open button here. For now, I will use the one provided by Blender, but you can use your own HDR or EXR file if you want to. Currently, I am opening the folder where I installed Blender. Find a subfolder named Data Files, and then open the Studio Lights folder, and then World. Let's choose this forest.exr file, and then click the Open Image button down here. As you can see, we now have a nice environment lighting and also reflections on the model surface just like what we have in the look depth mode. But notice the background now is filled with the forest background image from the EXR file. If, for example, you want to render the monkey head model and then later in Photoshop you want to use your own background, then you need to remove this background and replace it with transparency. Otherwise, you need to crop the monkey head model manually, which is unnecessary tedious labor. So, to make the background becomes transparent, you need to go to the Render Properties panel and find the Film section. Notice there is a transparent checkbox here. Just click on it, and now you can see the background disappeared and replaced by this checker pattern. This checker pattern is just an indication that this area will be transparent in the final rendering result, okay? To do the final rendering, we can use the F12 key for the shortcut. Or, if you forget the shortcut, you can go to the render menu up here and then choose Render Image here. Because we are using EV and the scene that we have is not complicated at all, the rendering finished instantly. After the rendering process is done, Blender will automatically open up the image editor as a floating window. And inside it, we can see the resulting image. To save this image to a file, you need to click on the image menu here, then choose Save As. Blender's file browser will show up. Here, we can specify the folder location of where we want to save the image. Down here, we can name the image. And at the right side, we can access the setting for the image format. You can click on this gear button to show or hide the setting panel. If you want to save the image along with its transparency, then you need to save it as PNG RGBA. A quick explanation about this option. BW here stands for black and white, or in other words, grayscale mode. RGB here means red, green, and blue, or in other words, it supports color. While RGBA here means color also, but with additional alpha channel to save the transparency information. Now, you need to be aware that not all image format supports transparency. For example, if you choose JPEG here, you can see JPEG format only supports grayscale and color images. It does not support RGBA. So that is something you need to keep in mind. Let's change this back to PNG. If you want to know more about image format and bit depth per channel, then I suggest you to watch the next lesson after this, okay? Next, you can then click the Save as Image button here, and it is done. You can now close this window. If you need to access the render result again, and you haven't made any changes from the last rendering, you don't really need to press F12 again. You can just open the image editor by clicking on the editor selector at the upper corner of the header bar. Or you can also access the rendering workspace up here if you want to. We can see the rendering result again here and the image menu where we can save the image. The last feature I want to mention in this lesson is the viewport screenshot, or officially named viewport render image. Remember when I mentioned earlier that you cannot output an image from render previews? Well, you can actually, but with some caveats. You can save what you see visually in the wireframe mode, solid mode, look depth mode, and the rendered mode to an image. But this feature works more like a screen capture functionality instead of a real image rendering. If you are like me, doing a lot of tutorials for Blender, this feature can be quite useful to capture what is being displayed in the viewport. So to do this, you can be in any viewport mode. For example, I choose the solid mode here. Then open the view menu up here, and then click on this viewport render image command. As you can see, Blender just generated an image from the viewport display. We can still see the access lines and the floor grid just as we see them in a viewport. You can save the image just like how we discussed before. Now you might be wondering, can I hide these access lines and the floor grid? Well, of course you can. Although personally, I prefer just pressing F12 to do the final rendering instead. Because in the final rendering, you won't see any of these viewport overlays. But if you still want to export the viewport display to an image without any of the overlays, then you can click on this overlays option button. Then turn off the floor and the access as needed. Essentially, if you don't see it in the viewport, then you won't see it in the viewport render image result. So if I do another viewport render, the overlays now are gone, okay? Again, this feature may not be for everyone, but it can be helpful if you are writing books or blog posts about Blender.